8. The Admiral Graf Spee. The Admiral Graf Spee was a German warship that mainly served in the Atlantic Ocean during the start of World War II. It was one of the 3 Deutschland-class cruisers, or pocket battleships, that were designed to outgun any enemy ship they met. The ship was named after Maximilian von Spee, a German admiral who died during the Battle of the Falkland Islands back in World War I. It was officially launched in 1934 and commissioned in 1936. It had a displacement weight of 14,890 tons and a length of 610 feet. It could reach speeds up to 28.5 knots. It was armed with 6 11-inch guns, 8 6-inch guns, 8 torpedo tubes, and even an aircraft catapult. Admiral Graf Spee's main goal was to disrupt the Allied merchant shipping that supplied all of Britain and France with vital resources and materials for the war. It operated as a commerce raider, attacking and sinking enemy ships while avoiding confrontation with superior naval forces. Between September and December 1939, it sank 9 Allied merchant ships in the South Atlantic and Northern Indian Oceans. Admiral Graf Spee's most famous fight was the Battle of the River Plate on December 13, 1939. It met face-to-face with a British naval squadron built of 3 cruisers, HMS Exeter, HMS Ajax, and HMS Achilles. The battle stretched on for about an hour, and the Admiral Graf Spee inflicted heavy damage on the Exeter and some moderate damage on the Ajax and Achilles. The ship also suffered significant damage to its fuel system and main battery line. The Graf Spee retreated to the neutral port of Montevideo in Uruguay, where it was able to stay for 4 days and make repairs. But the British used deception and diplomacy tactics to convince their captain, Hans Langsdorff, that he faced overwhelming odds if he tried to break out of the port. Langsdorff decided to sink his ship on December 17, 1939 to stop it from falling into enemy hands. He later took his own life, unable to live with the failure. The Admiral Graf Spee was an important symbol of German naval power and pride during World War II. Its exploits caused fear and anxiety among the country's enemies and boosted the morale of German soldiers and citizens. Its loss was a huge blow to the Kriegsmarine and a propaganda victory for the British and Allied forces. 7. Operation Barclay. In order to trick the Axis powers during their invasion of Sicily back in July 1943, the Allies thought up Operation Barclay during World War II. They wanted the Axis-aligned countries to think that they might attack Corsica, Sardinia, or Greece, not Sicily, which was the obvious target. The main deception tactic was to create a fake British 12th Army in the eastern Mediterranean region, which would supposedly invade Greece and join forces with the Turk and the Soviet armaments in the Balkans. The Allies used fake troop movements, radio traffic, maps, and even interpreters to make this army seem as real as possible. The Allies also staged multiple diversion attacks to support their lies. One of them was Operation Mincemeat, where they used a dead body with false documents and planted it in Spain, suggesting that the Allies would attack Sardinia and Corsica. Another one was Operation Waterfall, where a fake invasion fleet was quickly built up in Libya. The deception plans worked well. The Axis truly believed that the Allies had more forces in the eastern Mediterranean than they really did, so they reinforced their own troops in the Balkans and Italy. They also diverted their naval and air forces to cover the wrong areas. When the Allies actually invaded Sicily on July 10, 1943, they achieved a major surprise attack and faced less resistance than originally expected. Operation Barclay was one of the most successful deception operations in all of World War II. It showed how the Allies used intelligence, creativity, and cooperation in order to trick their enemies and gain the upper hand. 6. The Manhattan Project. During World War II, the United States led a secret project to make the first nuclear weapons. The project was officially dubbed the Manhattan Project, and it started in 1939 when President Franklin D. Roosevelt realized that Nazi Germany could be developing a similar weapon. The project involved thousands of scientists, engineers, military officials, and civilians from the United States, the United Kingdom, and even Canada. They worked mainly under the supervision of Major General Leslie Groves from the US Army Corps of Engineers and a nuclear physicist named Robert Oppenheimer. The main objectives of the project were to enrich uranium and produce plutonium, the two substances capable of causing nuclear fission. The project also designed and tested out the destructive weapons themselves. The Manhattan Project had many sites for research and production in the United States and its allied countries, but the most classified one was Los Alamos Laboratory, which was based in New Mexico. This was where Oppenheimer and his team of scientists worked on the weapon design. The project also performed several atomic tests, the most famous being the Trinity test, which took place on July 16, 1945. It was the first official explosion of a nuclear weapon. The project spent nearly $2 billion and employed about 130,000 people at its peak operation period. It produced two kinds of nuclear weapons: a gun-type weapon called Little Boy that used uranium-235 and an implosion weapon called Fat Man that used plutonium-239. These weapons were later used in the tragic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan on August 6th and 9th, 1945. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives in these attacks that essentially ended World War II. The Manhattan Project was one of the greatest scientific and technological achievements in all of human history, but also one of the most controversial and destructive ones ever. 5. Operation Paperclip. Operation Paperclip was a secret US intelligence program that brought 1,600 German and Austrian scientists over to the US after the end of World War II. The goal of the program was to use their expertise for military and industrial innovation and to stop them from falling into the hands of the Soviet Union. Operation Paperclip was a continuation of an earlier mission by the US and British forces to interrogate German scientists and engineers during the war effort. They discovered valuable information on technology such as rocketry, jet propulsion, biological and chemical weapons, and more. One of the most important documents they discovered was the Ossenberg List, a catalogue of scientists who worked for the Nazis. The program was authorized by Harry Truman in 1946, but he banned the recruitment of any active war criminals. This rule was often ignored by officials who were in charge of the operation. They erased or altered evidence of the scientists' Nazi affiliations or atrocities they'd committed to gain the upper hand over Russia. One of the most famous scientists brought to the US was Wernher von Braun, who developed the V-2 rocket. He played a significant role in the development of the American space program by creating the Saturn V rocket, which launched the Apollo missions to the moon. Operation Paperclip was a controversial program that raised many ethical questions about the morality of hiring former enemies and overlooking their many crimes. Supporters of the program argued that it was necessary for the Cold War to advance American technologies. Critics of the program denounced it as a betrayal of both justice and human rights. Do you think Operation Paperclip was justified? Let us know in the comments and be sure to subscribe to the channel. 4. The Kreipe Operation. The Kreipe Operation was a mission that aimed to kidnap a German general in Crete during World War II. The assignment was carried out by a team of British Special Operations Executive (SOE) agents, along with some Greek resistance fighters. The SOE was a secret organization that conducted sabotage, espionage, and guerrilla warfare from right behind the enemy lines. In Crete, the SOE supported the local resistance groups that had been fighting against the German occupation since 1941. The biggest target of the operation was General Heinrich Kreipe, the commander of the 22nd Air Landing Infantry Division, who replaced the notorious General Friedrich Wilhelm Müller back in March 1944. Müller was known for his brutal treatment of the Cretan population. The leader of the Kreipe mission was Major Patrick Leif Firma, an SOE officer who'd been living in Crete since the start of the war. He was joined by Captain William Stanley Moss, another officer, and two Cretan guides, Manolis Paterakis and Georgios Tirakis. The team hatched a plan to ambush Kreipe's car on his way from his home to the headquarters in Heraklion. On April 26, 1944, late at night, they stopped the car at a roadblock and overpowered Kreipe and his driver. Leiferma and Moss put on German uniforms and drove the car past multiple checkpoints, while Patarakis and Tarakis followed behind with Kreipe tied up in the back seat. The team then abandoned the car near Anogia and continued the journey on foot across the mountains, evading thousands of German soldiers who were searching for them. They were helped by a few Cretans, who provided food, shelter, and guides along their path. On May 14, 1944, after 18 days of trekking through the countryside, they reached the southern coast of Crete, where they were picked up by a British motorboat and taken to Egypt. Kreipe was later interrogated and sent to a prisoner of war camp across the sea in Canada. The operation was a huge propaganda boost win for the Allies and a morale boost for the Cretans. It also demonstrated the courage and keen skill of the SOE agents and their Greek allies. 3. Operation Corona. Operation Corona was a British Air Force strategy meant to confuse and disrupt German night fighter defenses during the Second World War. British troops used radio deception and electronic countermeasures to make false targets and jam German communications. The British had a secret service that analyzed German radio transmissions. They learned how the Germans operated their night fighter system, which relied heavily on ground-based radar stations and radio guidance to direct fighters. The English decided to exploit this system through Operation Corona, which involved sending specially equipped aircraft ahead of their main bomber force. These planes, called Mandrel, Moonshine, and Tinsel, had different roles and equipment than typical fighters. Mandrel aircraft held powerful transmitters that jammed the German radar frequencies, creating a window of interference that masked the bomber's stream. Moonshine aircraft carried devices that mimicked the radar returns of large bomber formations, creating false targets. Tinsel aircraft broadcast noises on German radio channels, creating confusion for the enemy's ground controllers. Operation Corona was first utilized in July 1943 during the Battle of Hamburg and was very effective. It reduced the losses of the British bombers and increased the damage inflicted on the German cities. It also forced the Nazis to change their tactics, which gave the British an advantage in the war. Corona was a clever and innovative use of radio deception and electronic warfare by England. It demonstrated their superior intelligence and technology over the German night fighter system. It also contributed to the strategic bombing campaign that weakened the entirety of the German war effort. 2. Operation Valkyrie. Operation Valkyrie's goal was to assassinate Adolf Hitler and overthrow the Nazi regime. It was devised by a group of anti-Nazi conspirators within the German army and civilian government and was led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. The plan involved hiding a bomb in Hitler's headquarters, the Wolf's Lair, and using the reserve army to gain control of key locations and arrest major Nazi leaders. The conspirators hoped to build a new government that would negotiate an end to the war. The plot was launched on July 20, 1944, when Stauffenberg put a briefcase with explosives near Hitler during a military conference. Sadly, the bomb failed to kill Hitler, who survived with some minor injuries. The coup attempt also failed, since the reserve army did not receive clear orders and many officers were loyal to Hitler. The conspirators were quickly executed, along with hundreds of others who had suspected involvement. Operation Valkyrie was the most famous and ambitious attempt to resist Hitler from inside Germany, but it ultimately failed due to poor planning. 1. How Team. In the last months of World War II, a small team of American soldiers and civilians launched a secret mission to collect valuable map data from the Nazis. Their goal was to help the Allied forces get further into Germany and prepare for the reconstruction of Europe. The team, which was called How Team, was led by Major Floyd W. Howe, a civil engineer who'd surveyed the American West and the South American rainforest before the war started. He was joined by 4 other civilians and 10 enlisted men, some of them who were refugees from Nazi Germany. They had special passes that let them move freely in the combat zone and access map-related materials. How Team searched for maps, aerial photographs, survey data, and more in libraries, archives, universities, factories, and even private homes. They gained access to thousands of documents, some of which were marked confidential in German. They also interrogated German map makers and some of their equipment. they sent their findings over to Washington, where they were analyzed and used for military purposes. The team's work had a significant impact on the war. They helped the Allies' forces plan their attacks and avoid enemy traps. They also offered valuable information for the creation of new boundaries and settlements. They uncovered Nazi plans for expansion and exploitation of resources in Africa and Asia. They even discovered a secret Nazi base built in Antarctica. How Team's mission was one of the most successful intelligence operations in the entire war, yet it remained secret for decades. The team members received little recognition for their service. Some of them continued their careers in mapping and surveying after the war, while others pursued different paths in life.
Number 8. Gangneung Submarine Infiltration Incident. As the devastating famine clung on to North Korea during the mid-90s, ultimately killing hundreds of thousands of civilians, officials in Pyongyang started to grow increasingly paranoid that South Korea would exploit the North's weakened state. Because of this, North Korea stepped up its military spying activities. In September 1996, a North Korean Sang-O-class submarine dropped a 3-member special reconnaissance team off near Gyeongdong-jin on South Korea's east coast. The team was sent to spy on military activities and to help carry out the assassination of President Kim Young-sam. After one attempt at picking up the team members for the return voyage to North Korea failed, the sub came back the next night to try again. Unfortunately, it ran aground on a reef and its propeller jammed thanks to seaweed. The crew was unable to get the sub free, so the captain ordered everyone to abandon ship. They then set the inside of the submarine on fire, and the 24 crew members quickly dispersed in an attempt to avoid getting caught by the South Korean military. 42,000 troops were later mobilized in a massive 49-day manhunt, during which all but 2 of the commandos were either killed or discovered dead somewhere. One was captured and another was never actually found. It's believed that he either made it back to North Korea or died along the way. Some of the infiltrators were wearing fake South Korean-style military uniforms to try and blend in with other soldiers. Toward the end of the extensive manhunt, 2 of the final infiltrators were executed near the North Korean border. They were carrying rolls of film holding photos of military installations that they took during the search. At the time, the government had claimed the facilities were airtight. This was quickly proved false. The men had even written in their diaries about spending a night playing video games at a ski resort only 18 miles from their site the submarine had run aground. North Korea initially claimed that the sub experienced a power failure and coincidentally drifted into southern waters. A few months later, the country expressed its deep regret over the incident, which pushed tensions between the North and South to their breaking point. The next day, South Korea returned the cremated remains of the commandos who passed away. The destroyed Sang-O sub was eventually salvaged and put on display at Tonggil Park near Gwangyong, where it stands to this day. North Korea wasn't blamed entirely for the incident. The South Korean military came under criticism over the fact that the sub somehow landed without being detected, despite South Korea's heavily guarded coastline. People were also outraged by how the manhunt played out and the many civilian deaths that came along with it. Number 7. The Sunshine Policy. By the late 1990s, the economic disparity between South Korea and its struggling northern neighbor was glaringly obvious. During his time in power, the former South Korean President Kim Dae-jung implemented something called the Sunshine Policy. Formerly called the Comprehensive Engagement Policy, it aimed to restore communication and economic activity between the two divided countries. The approach was surprising, since it came at a time when many were calling for more harsh and restrictive policies against the North, thanks to its antagonistic military activities and disturbing human rights violations. At times, these and other factors made it very difficult for the South to stick to the Sunshine Policy. Simply put, North Korea continued to do as they pleased, showing that they had no plans to concede in any ways that might actually improve its relationship with the South. The Sunshine Policy went back into effect in 1998, and ended just 1 decade later in 2008. Its first year proved to be one of the most challenging in terms of provocation from North Korea. A few particular incidents almost pushed the already strained relationship between the North and the South past its breaking point, including several naval skirmishes involving North Korean submarines that we'll be discussing soon. Number 6. 1998 Sokcho Submarine Incident. On June 22nd, a North Korean Yugo-class submarine got caught up in a fishing drift net in southern Korean waters about 11 miles off the city of Sokcho's coast and about 21 miles south of the country's border. A fishing crew found the vessel when they noticed members of the submarine crew trying to untangle their sub. The fishermen immediately notified the South Korean Navy, and a corvette was quickly dispatched to tow the submarine out to the port of Donghae, with its crew still inside. While being towed, the submarine sank. To this day, it's unclear whether the crew deliberately went down or if the vessel sank due to damage. In its announcement of the tragedy, North Korea's state-run news agency claimed that the sub was simply lost in a training accident. 3 days after the sinking, the South Korean Navy decided to raise the vessel. Inside, they located the deceased bodies of 9 North Korean sailors. 5 crewmen had been seemingly executed, while the other 4 had opted to take their own lives. The submarine held an array of military supplies including 2 automatic rifles, 2 machine guns, a shoulder-fired rocket launcher, hand grenades, diving equipment, oxygen tanks, and more. There were also taboo South Korean beverages on board, suggesting that the men had recently completed an espionage mission on dry land. According to the sub's logbook, it had infiltrated South Korean waters multiple times in the past. Despite growing frustrations with the North's spying, South Korea reacted peacefully to the situation, and the bodies were returned without any fight. Still, during this time, the South was clinging to the hope that the Sunshine Policy would eventually pay off through an improved relationship with the North. Number 5. 1998 Yeosu Submersible Incident. Late one night towards the end of December 1998, roughly 6 months after the Sokcho submarine incident, South Korean soldiers located a low-riding vessel about 2 miles from the city of Yeosu. Harbor traffic was halted, while 2 Navy patrol boats were dispatched to search for the mysterious boat. Their efforts were initially fruitless, but the vessel was spotted again just a few hours later and was finally identified as a North Korean Improved Submersible Infiltration Landing Craft, or an ISILC semi-submersible. In an article he wrote, Sebastian Roblin described the vehicle as a 43-foot-long, low-riding motorboat coated in anti-radar paint. It had the ability to submerge, concealing all but a small portion of the vessel under the water's surface. At 5:35 a.m., a South Korean boat fired warning shots while chasing after the ISILC 62 miles south of Jeoju Island. The North Koreans fired at the ships in a defensive response. 13 minutes after the first warning shots, the South Koreans shot and sank the semi-submersible. About an hour later, the Navy retrieved the body of a North Korean soldier. A little over a month after the skirmish, the sunken vessel was discovered at a depth of 500 feet below the sea. 2 days later, a body was found with a rifle and live ammunition inside the ship's stern. The sub was officially raised on March 1999, and 2 more bodies were located inside. Based on its size, investigators concluded that the ISILC was probably run by a 4-person crew and that all the crew's remains had been recovered. Not surprisingly, North Korea denied having any knowledge of the vessel and claimed that they certainly hadn't sent it to the area. In fact, their government issued a statement strongly implying that the South had somehow made the whole thing up to make them look bad. It also warned that North Korea could no longer be a passive onlooker while the South waged an anti-communist campaign against them. The Yeosu skirmish fueled tensions between the North and the South and would eventually lead to an even bigger naval skirmish the next year. But the Sunshine Policy remained in place even as this situation escalated. In our current climate, what's your opinion of North Korea? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Number 4. The First Battle of Yeonpyeong. In 1999, North Korea started a campaign to redraw a set of maritime boundary called the Northern Limit Line. After the 1953 armistice that brought the North Korean War to a standstill, which is currently ongoing today, the North and South couldn't agree on a border in the Yellow Sea. Based on the North's belief of what belonged to it, the country decided to accuse the South of violating the sea boundary line by sending naval vessels into its neighbor's water. In reality, the ships had stayed on the south side of the NLL, but the North had no interest in actually recognizing this boundary. Over a week-long period in June of that year, North Korean ships crossed the NLL multiple times. When they refused to back down under the South's orders to retreat, the South Korean Navy resorted to using force by physically pushing the northern boats back across the boundary. The Northerners initially responded by trying to carry out their own bumping initiative, but they were swiftly outmaneuvered by the South, causing them to eventually retreat. They made another attempt just 2 days later, but they were once again outmaneuvered by the South Koreans. The engagement later escalated into gunfire, with the North firing first. Over the next 14 minutes, the South Koreans fired approximately 4,600 shots, sinking at least one torpedo boat and causing damage to several more. An estimated 17 to 13 North Koreans were killed in the skirmish. A handful of South Korean boats were damaged and 9 sailors were injured, but everyone on their side survived. The North Korean government declared victory, despite all the signs pointing to the opposite being true, and the fight gave rise to increased military tensions that continued for years, making an all-out war seem like an increasingly feasible prospect. Number 3. The Second Battle of Yeonpyeong. The dispute over the Northern Limit Line didn't exactly end with the First Battle of Yeonpyeong. Back in 2002, almost 3 years after the first battle, a North Korean patrol boat crossed over the NLL and into South Korean waters. It was ordered to turn back, but was soon followed by a second North Korean vessel with no regard for the warnings. The pair of boats started harassing the 2 South Korean vessels that were chasing them. About 3 miles south of the NLL, the North Korean boats opened fire on their neighbors' boats, striking the wheelhouse of patrol boat PKM-357. A 10-minute skirmish ensued before South Korean reinforcement boats made it to the scene. It quickly became clear to the North Koreans that they were vastly outnumbered and outpowered, so they retreated back across the NLL. PKM-357 sank while being towed back to port. It was eventually raised and brought back to Pyeongtaek Naval Base, where it operates today as a naval museum open to the public. 13 North Koreans were killed in the fight and 25 were wounded in the Second Battle of Yeonpyeong, while 6 South Koreans were killed and 18 received injuries. South Korea demanded an apology, but the North didn't give in. They even blamed the South for the incident. After the battle, the South Korean military introduced increased security measures. It adopted a new policy of being able to shoot first at North Korean vessels that acted threatening in nature or crossed into their territory. Number 2. Further incidents. In November 2009, North Korean boats once again tested the South's patience by crossing over the Northern Limit Line. After getting 2 verbal warnings and a warning shot for good measure, the North Koreans opened fire on a South Korean vessel. There was a short exchange of gunfire before the ships went their separate ways. No South Koreans died, while North Korean deaths were estimated between 1 and 10. North Korea accused the South of provoking the incident and asking the country to apologize, but this never happened. 1 year later, North Korea fired 170 artillery shells at the island of Yeonpyeong. Their intended target was a military garrison, but at least a dozen civilian homes were destroyed in the exchange. It was the first attack on a civilian site since the 1953 armistice brought a halt to the Korean War 57 years before. Once again, the skirmish was related to the disputed Yellow Sea maritime border called the Northern Limit Line and the North's attempt to assert territorial claims. 2 South Korean civilians and 1 military member were killed, while the casualties to the north were unclear. The South Korean military fell under criticism for being weak and ill-prepared, much like it had in the past after other incidents involving its neighbors. Following the attack, the country's defense minister resigned. Most civilians moved away from Yeonpyeong, and the military decided to increase its presence on the island. Number 1. The end of the Sunshine Policy. By 2006, many were questioning how South Korea could maintain the Sunshine Policy toward the North when it was abundantly clear that the North was not going to stop its military provocations, which included the development of nuclear weapons. As the South ran out of reasons to keep the policy, it suspended its aid shipments to the North but kept some parts of the policy intact. After becoming the new South Korean president in 2008, Lee Myung-bak took a more conservative and hardline stance to the North compared to past leaders. He refused to expand the economic interest at the Kaesong Industrial Region in North Korea, where South Korean businesses hired North Korean workers. He made it clear that the North had to work toward a resolution with the West over its nuclear ambitions if they wanted economic enrichment. That didn't happen, and by the end of the year, the Sunshine Policy was basically dead. It was declared a complete failure and officially canceled 2 years later in 2010. A lot of things happened during the Sunshine period that could have pushed the North and South into a full-blown war, and not all of the incidents involved submarines. Most of the closest calls were through naval skirmishes and submarine-related events.
8. Operation Sunshine. Between October 1944 and May 1945, Norwegian and British military personnel jointly undertook an effort to preserve German-occupied Norway's power stations and other essential installations. Dubbed Operation Sunshine, the project was planned with the worst-case scenario of a German scorched earth campaign in mind. Being prepared to prevent this type of attack from happening took months of meticulous preparation. But with the power plants in the region providing roughly 60% of the region's electricity, it was important to get it right. Hundreds of soldiers were ready to defend various designated districts at any given moment. As they descended upon the region, they imprisoned Norwegian SS soldiers and Nazis. The most heavily protected zone, known as the North Section, included Norway's biggest power station along with several other major facilities. Many men lived in small groups of up to 10 in cabins spread throughout the area. Everything they needed, from weapons to uniforms to food items, was airdropped. Others, who already lived in the region, carried on with their lives as usual but were prepared to mobilize if the need arose. This was one of several harrowing Allied military missions that were carried out in German-occupied Norway throughout World War II. In the unforgiving climate of the High North, even the most mundane operations were uniquely challenging. Luckily, Operation Sunshine was largely a success, despite some casualties and close calls, including the death of the mission's leader, Leif Tronstad, under circumstances that remain somewhat unclear to this day. The operation came to an end when the Nazis surrendered to the Allies toward the end of the war. 7. Operation Acid Gambit. An American spy named Kurt Muse found himself in a terrifyingly difficult position in 1989 when he was caught plotting the overthrow of the Panamanian government while in Panama. He spent the next several months languishing in a Panamanian prison while the US military plotted its invasion of Panama, as well as a mission to rescue Muse. As tensions between the US and Panama peaked, dictator Manuel Noriega vowed to shoot Muse before anyone else in the event of a conflict between the two countries. But the Americans were determined to rescue Muse. In a highly sensitive mission codenamed Operation Acid Gambit, members of the Army Special Forces landed on the prison roof, then rushed down to Muse's cell, where they killed a guard who was tasked with preventing the captive's rescue. Using an explosive, the Americans blasted open Muse's cell and gave him body armor, a ballistic helmet, and goggles. They moved him up to the prison roof, where helicopters retrieved everyone involved in the operation and carried them to safety. Unfortunately, the chopper transporting Muse crashed while leaving the site. 4 military members were wounded, but luckily no one died. Several years later, Muse went on to collaborate with best-selling author John Gilstrap to write a book of his harrowing experience called 6 Minutes to Freedom. 6. Borne Sulinowo. Hidden deep in the woods of northwestern Poland, the town of Borne Sulinowo operated as a top-secret Soviet nuclear base from 1945 to 1992. During that time, it didn't appear on any map. The settlement was home to the largest concentration of Soviet ground forces in Poland, with nearly 12,000 troops stationed at the base at the height of the Cold War. Only one road and one railroad track led in and out of the town, which was surrounded by electrified fences and concealed behind the thick forest. Borne Sulinowo's roots date back to the 16th century, when just a handful of people lived in the area. After World War II, the Red Army took control of a region encompassing the town and 2 military bases. The site remained a secret to the public for 50 years, until the Polish government reached an agreement for the Red Army's withdrawal following the collapse of the Iron Curtain. After the last military personnel cleared out, Borne Sulinowo became a civilian town, and a special pass was no longer required to visit or live there. Most of its first new residents were Polish repatriates who'd been forcibly resettled in Siberia and Kazakhstan a half-century earlier to make room for the military base. An estimated 1,500 people live in Borne Sulinowo today, just a fraction of the peak population during its Soviet years. As a result, many of the buildings that were used by the Red Army now stand abandoned and derelict. Besides being a popular tourist attraction for those who are willing to make the long drive through some of Poland's most remote countryside, the area surrounding Borne Sulinowo hosted Defender Europe 2, which was said to be Europe's biggest military event in 25 years. Would you like to visit this site and see it for yourself? Let us know in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. 5. The Rockall Dispute. Located in the North Atlantic, roughly 230 miles off the Scottish coast, Rockall is a 100-foot wide, uninhabitable rock that serves no truly utilitarian purpose, yet it's at the center of a decades-long dispute between Ireland and the United Kingdom. The ongoing disagreement dates back to 1955, when the UK claimed territorial rights over Rockall. A Royal Navy team travelled to the site, planted a flag, and installed a plaque laying claim to the 70-foot-high boulder. In 1972, the giant hunk of granite was officially incorporated as part of Scotland. The UK acknowledges that as a rock incapable of human habitation, it cannot claim an exclusive economic zone for Rockall under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. But the country asserts its right to a territorial sea, extending 13.7 miles from Rockall. Declassified documents that were released in 2017 revealed that the UK laid claim to Rockall because the British were worried that it could be used as a spy station for hostile agents. Ireland, on the other hand, does not recognise the UK's claim, but also doesn't claim sovereignty over Rockall for itself. For generations, the Irish government has maintained its position that Rockall and similar features have no realistic basis for territorial claims. The dispute over the property continues to this day at the cost of millions of euros per year to the Irish fishing industry, according to Minister for Agriculture, Food and the Marine Charlie McConalogue. As things currently stand, there appears to be no resolution in the foreseeable future. 4. Operation Bunyan. North and South Korea are separated by a border known as the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ, which runs along the 38th parallel. The majority of it sits mostly untouched by humans, minus a section called the Joint Security Area, or JSA, where North and South Korean guards infamously stand face to face. It was in this area that US Army officers Captain Arthur Boniface and First Lieutenant Mark Barrett were axe-murdered by North Korean troops while cutting down a poplar tree in 1976. According to North Korea's version of events, a group of 14 American hoodlums instigated the deadly encounter. Kim Jong-il described the incident as an unprovoked attack on his guards. He called for the removal of US troops from Korea. The CIA, on the other hand, claimed that the attack was planned by the North Koreans. Rather than withdrawing from Korea, American forces were upgraded to a heightened level of readiness for potential conflict. 3 days after the killings, a convoy of American and South Korean military vehicles drove into the JSA and cut the poplar tree down with chainsaws. No warning was given to the North Korean guards, and the operation was carried out as a deliberate show of force. Meanwhile, the United Nations Command informed the North Koreans that the unfinished work on the tree was being peacefully carried out. 42 minutes later, the tree was finished being cut down, and luckily there was no more violence stemming from the incident. 3. Operation Vegetarian. In 1942, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill greenlighted a biological warfare experiment that sought to weaponize anthrax against the Nazis. Ironically codenamed Operation Vegetarian, the plan involved figuring out how to manufacture anthrax cakes that would be dropped down into cattle fields. Theoretically speaking, the cows would eat the cakes and become infected. Then the Germans would eat the infected beef and die. If the project had come to fruition and actually been put to use, the results would have been catastrophic. The majority of Germany's cows would die, causing a massive food shortage which would only hasten the deaths of millions of civilians. Before developing the product, scientists wanted to make sure that the anthrax bacteria could effectively wipe out an animal population. They chose a small 520-acre landmass off the Scottish coast called Greenard Island as the testing ground for Operation Vegetarian. 60 sheep were shipped to the island before the British dropped copious amounts of anthrax from overhead. Within days, all the sheep died. Much to the project planners' delight, the test run was more effective than they expected. But they weren't prepared for the undesirable things that can happen when large amounts of a deadly pathogen are released into the air, water, and ground. The anthrax spread, infecting numerous farm animals on the mainland. Testing at Greenard nevertheless continued until sometime in 1943, when the risk of spreading became too great and the island was quarantined. By the time Operation Vegetarian was ready to go into effect, the invasion of Normandy, better known as D-Day, had already occurred, and the Allies were making their way across Europe. It was too late to drop any anthrax over Germany, and in hindsight it's a major relief that it never happened. Not only would the initial impact be deadly beyond justification, the cleanup of the pollution on Greenard Island alone has come at a sky-high financial cost. A vast swathe of Europe would have been toxic for decades to come, and the consequences would have spread beyond the targeted country. 2. If Day. In a bid to promote the sale of victory bonds during World War II, the Canadian government decided to give people an idea of what a Nazi invasion into North America might be like. In Winnipeg's largest ever military exercise up until that point, 3,500 of the country's troops simulated a German occupation of the city on February 19, 1942. Dubbed If Day, the disturbing collection of events includes a mock firefight between Canadian soldiers and volunteers dressed as Germans, the staged internment of politicians, and a Nazi parade. If it sounds like the military was trying to scare people into buying war bonds, it's because that's exactly what they were hoping to do. Officials believed that the event would generate fear among people who were not very worried, since they were not directly being affected by the conflict. By putting national security at the forefront of people's minds, the hope was that they would see it as their civic duty to contribute whatever they could. The local newspaper announced the mock invasion ahead of time, but plenty of people were still unaware of the planned event and were taken by surprise when it happened. And it must have been pretty alarming, considering the lengths the event's organizers went to make it seem real. In addition to airing radio broadcasts as if the invasion were actually taking place, the Canadian military flew Royal Air Force planes that were decorated to look like Nazi aircraft over the city. A decree containing a list of authoritarian new rules was posted all over Winnipeg, showcasing new policies including a 9:30 p.m. curfew and the requirement for civilians to be willing to house as many as 5 soldiers. At the bottom was a command in all caps, warning residents not to go against anything in the decree. The performance had its intended effect of causing war bond sales to skyrocket, raising a record $3.2 million in just one day for that particular loan campaign. And the added bonus of drawing attention to the war effort throughout North America. It was featured in Life magazine, Newsweek, and the New York Times, attracting even more victory bond sales throughout the US and Canada. 1. Operation Gold. As the Cold War heated up during the 1950s, the American CIA and the British MI6 intelligence agencies jointly undertook an effort to wiretap a telephone line connected to the Soviet Red Army headquarters in East Berlin. Dubbed Operation Gold or Operation Stopwatch, the mission was born out of the growing fear that a Soviet nuclear attack could strike the Western world at any given moment. And there were valid reasons to be concerned, especially after the USSR detonated a hydrogen bomb in 1953 as part of the Soviet atomic bomb project. Construction on the tunnel that would enable the wiretap began in late 1954 and was finished 8 months later. For nearly a year, the Americans listened in on as many as 90,000 phone calls, hoping to pick up on any possible warlike intentions being discussed by the Soviet army. Little did they realize the Red Army was aware of the wiretap, courtesy of a double agent named George Blake. To prevent Blake from being exposed, they pretended not to discover it until 1956. Under the orders of then CIA Director Alan Dulles, those listening in wrote down as little as possible. For this reason, limited details are available about any useful intelligence that was gleaned from the operation. And while Dulles highly praised the project as a success on the CIA's behalf, recently declassified documents suggest that the National Security Agency was far less impressed with the findings. Western officials remained unaware that the Soviets had known about the tunnel essentially from the beginning until Blake's arrest in 1961. Today, an excavated section of the tunnel is on display at the Allied Museum in Berlin. Thanks for watching. Which one of these military operations is the craziest to you? Let us know in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.